generous introduction. It always gives me great pleasure to come to the campus of the University of Malaya. As he reminded you, I was here at the start. There was just a lake and very little else. So I have great nostalgia for the university, also my alma mater, and the site as a new campus. I still remember all those early buildings when I get taken around each time. Memories come back, and I'm filled with nostalgia for that period of time too. So it is always with affection and respect that I come to this campus, and I'm delighted to be here, thanks to Professor Wang. Actually, when Danny asked me to speak at this conference, I really felt very inadequate because I have not followed the relations between China and Malaysia very closely. It's been a fantastic 40 years in that relationship. The developments have been really quite extraordinary, and it is something really to celebrate. The relationship is developed from strength to strength, and I know there are many people in this room who know far more about that bilateral relationship than I do, so I'm not really qualified to talk on that. But then he assured me that what he would like me to talk about would be more general one about China and the region as a whole. And that is something I'm a little more comfortable with, in part because of the years I've spent in Singapore heading an institute called the East Asian Institute. And I bring greetings from that institute to our fellow Institute of China Studies here. We were delighted when the University of Malaya started this institute, and we are extremely pleased to see how well it has done and how much has come from that institute. In Singapore, it has been a somewhat different story because it's a long story. I won't go into that, but simply to say that in the case of Singapore, in a very strange, paradoxical way, Singapore did not establish diplomatic relations with China early. Unlike the very imaginative former Prime Minister Tun Razak, who took the initiative to establish that relationship as early as 1974, Singapore held back, and it was not until 1991 that formal diplomatic relations were established, quite a long while after Malaysia. And so it was in that particular context of Singapore's belated diplomatic relationship with China that the Institute of East Asian Political Economy was established by Dr. Goh Kim Sui, at that time having just retired as the former Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. And he established it on the very simple grounds that the people of Singapore, even the government of Singapore, knew so little about the People's Republic of China. And he actually said that very openly, that because of that ignorance, the big gap in their knowledge, they needed an institute to speed up the understanding of China. And so from the very beginning, he established the institute with one very specific purpose, which is to understand the domestic developments of China. He was quite specific about that. He felt that there were many, many institutes in the world studying the foreign relations of China, and many other people who have studied the strategic and other international relations aspects of China. He felt that that was probably quite well covered, and it was possible for the Singapore government and its officials and its people to follow that part of it. But it was the domestic developments of China that was particularly mysterious, you might say, difficult to understand. Having now been in Singapore for nearly 18 years and been associated with that institute from the start, I can confirm that he was dead right. The domestic developments of China are very difficult to follow. Even after 18 years, we are all still struggling. There's so much to know, so difficult to understand the width and breadth of country and the depth of various kinds of developments and its whole historical background. And we are still learning. And so I want just to say this because this is something we share with the Institute of China Studies here at the University of Malaya. And it is something that we hope will one day lead us to be able to say, we now understand China a little bit more than before. It's really been quite a journey. And I want to say that it's been extremely satisfying. There's so much to learn, and we never learn enough. And for that, tremendous efforts are still necessary. So I say that as greetings from the East Asian Institute. For today, I really wasn't quite sure how to address today's meeting. I picked the subject on something that happens to interest me, certain norms in a region or in the world, in history. And I've been trying to understand that. By norms, I don't have any very specific set of norms in mind, but to say that at a particular time, certain things are regarded as normal. Certain things are regarded as the basis for the future. So to be treated as normal from then onwards. Whether it is treated that way or not, of course, is a different matter. But certain ideas about what should be the norm emerge at a particular point of time. And then, of course, we know norms change. And so we try and trace it, and whether there are any major changes in those norms is a matter, of course, of historical interest. I won't go too far back. Let me just say that since we had at the beginning many references to how the relationship between Malaysia and China began in 1974, I might just start with 1974. What were the norms in 1974? As I said earlier, Minister Tun Razak was really imaginative and courageous to take the step he did. This was in the middle of the Cold War, as we all know. 1974 may be traced back in a way, the norms of 1974 may be traced back in a way to the end of World War II. After 1945, when Europe basically self-destructed, a new world order came out of that war with the United States and the Soviet Union as the two major powers in the world, making every effort to divide the world between them. A kind of two-world psychological and Cold War began, in which the stakes were very high, and both sides were gathering together partners, alliances, allies to try and continue to divide the world. Each side, of course, hoping to defeat the other ultimately in an ideological struggle, which you all know about, between communism and liberal capitalism, if you like. And that lasted from 1945 till early 1990s, 1991 perhaps, when the USSR collapsed and the Cold War was officially declared as ended. So 1974 was something like half-time. You know, when you break for lunch or go and have a drink, half-time. And it was a very good time because it was half-time in terms of that particular struggle, when China began to pull away from the Soviet Union's alliance. Or you can see it the other way around, with the Soviet Union decided that the Chinese were not performing according to the Soviet Union's wishes. And in particular, the climax of it all was the fact that Mao Zedong launched his Cultural Revolution, which, as you know, was extremely destructive, and almost in every respect, the opposite of what Moscow wanted in the Cold War. Moscow, the Warsaw Pact Alliance, they didn't want to see that, and the Cultural Revolutions represented the aberration. And so it was that ended the cozy relationship that the two leaders of China and Russia in 1949 had hoped for. So in that half-time period, that lots of things are happening. As you know, the United States, Kissinger went to China, China got admitted into the United Nations, and in that context, when things were still pretty open and uncertain, Malaysia's Prime Minister took that initiative, and I believe that really was a historical step, particularly for ASEAN, taking that lead in changing the nature of that norm for our part of the world, really quite exceptional. Just remember, it was still very much a deep thing for ASEAN. We were still in the middle of the Vietnam War, at least towards the end game, the Vietnam War end game, and it was pretty clear that the United States was defeated in Vietnam and would have to withdraw. So there were really uncertain times. Recalling them, even when I think about it today, I really admire the imagination and the courage of Tun Razak to have taken that decision at that particular point in time. And it was really quite extraordinary. That relationship, as we all know, really has turned around the whole region's relationship with China to a great extent. Now let me leave it now and say 2014, 40 years later, we've had a major change with the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was dramatic in one sense, but in another sense we can say that it actually was the beginning of a new set of norms. The norms of 1945 had set up two major blocks of great powers, the United States and Soviet Union with their allies and friends. But after 1991, after the end of the Cold War, we were faced with a world with only one superpower, the sole superpower of the United States. And that's a new norm. I don't think the world, throughout its history, has ever had a time when we had one power as powerful as the United States and prepared to, willing to, in fact, ambitious to be the number one power over the whole world for an indefinite period of time. That's exceptional in world history. So in that sense, you can say we have a new norm since the 1990s. And it's now been just over 22, 23 years since that new norm has been established. And we look at these new norms and we can see that it's a very difficult set of new norms. Actually, in many ways, much more uncertain than the previous norm of post-World War II. Because from 1945 to 1990, for all the difficulties people faced at that time, there was a certain predictability about it, because there were two great powers, as some people call it, the central balance of the two powers, and there was a certain pattern, as it were, rhythm to it. You could understand it, you can adapt to it or adjust to it according to how you interpret the relationship between two big blocks that were dominating the world. But in a one superpower world, we have discovered in the last 20-odd years how uncertain it is. For one thing, the one superpower is not quite strong enough to dominate the whole world. For another thing, that being one superpower, it invites challenges from people who don't want to see one superpower, who like to see it at least sharing some of that power with others. So there are all sorts of new variables that have come into this new set of norms. I won't go into that in detail, but one of the key developments that in many ways surprised the world was the rapid rise of China. But another part of it, probably less surprising, was the helplessness of the United States in facing the fact that the world is so complicated, and being the one superpower was no fun at all. And they've had a miserable time trying to be that one superpower. They've had some successes, but also some miserable failures. And in the course of it all, they've learned something, the United States have learned something, the rest of the world have also learned something. What this world of one superpower means, why it is unstable, and why it is probably, in the long run, unsustainable. So at least there's a question mark to this new set of norms. And among those various things that happened in the last 20-odd years, the rapid rise of China was probably the most dramatic. And that is why there is so much attention given to China today. Not only because China is successful, but because everybody was so surprised that it became successful so quickly. I can assure you that when I started with the East Asian Institute in NUS in 1996, when I got there after Hong Kong, it was far from certain. China was rising, but it was far from certain that China was going to rise to the extent and at the speed that it did. So even those of us who were observing China were surprised. And I can assure you that many fellow China watchers or people who were very keenly concerned for China were equally surprised at the actual speed at which they have achieved what they have done today. So that is a new element that adds to the somewhat uncertain pattern of world development with one sole superpower. So this, to me, can be described as a new norm. So in the context of old norms and new norms, I just take these post-World War II two examples to show how the norms have been changed, modified, in my I would say actually transformed in the last 60, 70 years. So with the new norms, of course, we face different issues. The first set of norms, in a way, was very simple because it was so carefully described as being an ideological war between communism and capitalism. It's either victory for one and victory for the other, and it was a very dramatic battle, or struggle for power. And in the end, you may argue that the capitalists were victorious. It was a triumphant West that defeated the failed Soviet Union that created a new set of norms. Now, in that triumphant conclusion in the 1990s, something was highlighted. This one superpower, how did it become that? What was so particularly important about that event? And why was it special to the rest of us? Was a kind of thing that went back to the American idea of exceptionalism, which is an idea which has been in the United States for some time, and basically explaining how the United States became the very special kind of country that it was. It was certainly a very unusual country. There's no clear examples in the past before that. But when the United States achieved its independence over 200 years ago, it was the first country of its kind established on the whole basis of a revolutionary war that had a whole set of principles, and how that set of principles was carried through by generations of the American pioneers. They expanded and expanded and expanded until they dominated the whole world. Now, from that point of view, the trajectory of that successful expansion over in less than 200 years, they were the most important, most powerful country in the world. That made the Americans feel that they were exceptional in some very special and extraordinary way. And that sense of exceptionalism came to a climax with the victory over the USSR in the Cold War in the 1990s. And from then onwards, you can see the American people, the leadership as well as the people, grappling with the idea of what it means to have this exceptionalism. What was it? At the heart of it, I think, is a sense of missionary purpose. And if you look at that, then we can say that this is something much deeper than 1945 or 1990s. It really goes back hundreds of years, maybe even more than 1,000 years. A sense of mission about bringing peace, goodwill, all the forces of good, as it were, against the forces of evil, with the blessing of God, and all that sense of that drove the imagination of the American people, that the Americans represented something really special. That missionary fervor comes out in many, many forms. And most of the time, before the United States became powerful, it was in the form of missionary doctors, teachers, preaching the word of God to people who were not Christians. And they were very devoted. And you can see the history of American missions. Extremely peaceful. In fact, very very devoted, dedicated people, many of them sacrificing their lives for something that they all believed in. But that was when America was not powerful. There were people who went out there really individually committed to some mission. But that sense of mission, however, was very deeply seated in the psyche of the whole people. And the roots of that go further back. And from our point of view, in our region, we experienced that way back, I would say, from 1498, when the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope and came into the Indian Ocean, with the message, very clear message, that was assigned to the King of Portugal and his ministers, that they went out not only in search of spices, but also in search of Christians. It has always been Christians and spices as part of the mission, a kind of two-pronged initiative to try and do what they wanted for their country, but always based on not just trade alone, but also the mission to bring a message to the people who were not yet Christians. That was how it began. And in fact, if you go further back, of course, there's a long history behind that. I won't go into that. But I simply want to remind ourselves that this exceptionalism that the United States represents today is deeply rooted in this missionary drive, which is deeply rooted in something that started when the Europeans came out of the Mediterranean into the Atlantic and into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and brought what we call globalization to the world today. I mean, that really reminds us what underlies the whole history of globalization. To put it very simply, if I put it in the formula, I would simply say global is maritime. As long as you depended on land and land relationships, land conquests, land invasions, land peaceful missions, and so on, it is limited to the Eurasian continent. All our history that we learn about, at least the recorded history, all to do with the Eurasian continent. Essentially about Europe, Asia, and bits of North Africa. For most of the thousands of years of history, that's where we talked about. We knew nothing about the two Americas. We knew very little about Africa south of the Sahara. So that was global. The most global thing we ever talked about in the past was the largest land empire of all time, and that was the Mongol Empire, which stretched all the way from the eastern coast of Asia to the gates of Vienna, as they say, or to Central Europe. Now that's the largest empire. That was about as global as you can imagine in that Eurasian period of history. But to truly global present, the global history that we talk about today really refers to the period after 1500, because of maritime power. Once you cross the Atlantic, once you cut down the Cape of Good Hope to the Indian Ocean, and you cross into the Pacific, as Magellan did very shortly after that, then you really tie up the whole world through maritime linkages. So maritime is global, global is maritime, is my little reminder of that transformation about 500 years ago. And behind that, as I mentioned, between Christians and spices, and the way the Spanish and the Portuguese divided the world in the first treaty that the Pope made them sign, was a sign of that, a mission to bring the Word of God to all humans, everybody that they can get in touch with it, and to fight in the name of God as well. And always, when put in those terms, every victory was a victory for good, and every defeat has to be corrected by future victories in the name of God for the sake of good. So that is a mission. And let me not try to make it sound as if it's not important. It was a very serious mission, and it had its ups and downs. For a while, the mission wasn't taken too seriously, as trade became very profitable, greed took over, and eventually it became imperialism, taking over lands, started by the Dutch and the British, and later on followed by the French and others, into all of Africa and Asia. And of course, following Columbus, of course, the Latin, Southern and Northern America were all settled. But in that context, the mission changed somewhat from that of preaching the word to, in fact, expanding empires. And the two became, in a way, closely associated and inseparable for hundreds of years. Although on the surface, as the European West became more and more secular, the emphasis was upon trade, industry, and following the Industrial Revolution, of course, industrial superiority, technological superiority, commercial, and ultimately military superiority over everybody else. Hence the domination of the world, which followed in the 19th century, by the 19th century. So in fact, that is a kind of potted history for you to tell you that the origins of this exceptionalism is not in America. It is really goes back a long, long way, and you can go further back if you like. But let me stop at that. What is the answer to this exceptionalism? The rise of China reminds us at least there are some other possible answers, but you can look at it from different points of view. In other words, different civilizations, whether it's the Islamic, the Hindu-Buddhist, or the Chinese, East Asian, there are different ways of looking at the world and different ways of looking at how exceptional they all are. And of course, everybody is exceptional in some way if you look at it that way. I'm not sure whether we can use the same word exceptionalism for all of them, certainly not with the same intensity. It hasn't got the same set of meanings that the word exceptionalism has for the Americans. But I think if you look hard at it, every one of these groups of people consider themselves or their place in the world as exceptional in some way or the other. Now for our region and for my talk today, since I'm going to talk about China, what is China's idea of its exceptionalism? As someone who's been studying China for a long, long time, and I still have lots of things I don't know about China and don't fully understand. But let me try and sum it up in this way. As I understand it, the Chinese have been, as a civilization, as a group of people, have been extremely self-centered. Almost the opposite of missionary, being missionary. They have not been known to set out to bring any mission to anybody. On the contrary, they were very receptive to other people bringing their missions to China. I mean, the days when Buddhism, for example, when they arrived in China, was well received and taken into the Chinese context and totally, as it were, accepted by the Chinese very openly. From the Tang Dynasty onwards, it had become the religion of the majority of the Chinese people, and it had come from outside, and the Chinese had no difficulty about it. And the Chinese did not reciprocate in any kind of mission out of China to anybody. And that has been so ever since. I cannot trace any sign of the Chinese wanting to bring their mission to others in any serious way. Even in the days, if you go further back to the way the Koreans or the Japanese and Vietnamese looked to China, of course it was a mixture of the very early days when there were some military conflicts involved in Korea and Vietnam. But on the whole, it was the people of Korea, Japan, and Vietnam who found something interesting in China and went to China to study. But it was not the Chinese actually being missionary about what they stood for. So there was a kind of self-centeredness about Chinese civilization. For better or for worse, that had led it to become, in fact, quite focused internally for a very long time. Most people, when they talk about today, make a lot of emphasis upon China's capacities, military and other capacities, very early on, people all are a bit puzzled as to why the Chinese didn't go further. A perfect example is the often quoted, especially in the Malaysian context with Malacca and so on, was the Zhenhe expeditions, the naval expeditions of 1405 to 1435. About 30 years of 7 major naval expeditions, the largest naval expeditions in the world up to then, the biggest fleets that have been set out, go to Indian Ocean, across to Persian Gulf, Red Sea, east coast of Africa, back and forth, and then stopped. And looking back at it, you see that as an aberration. There was nothing in the history of China before that or after that that could quite explain it. I won't try and explain that because I can go into that because the fascinating story. But I won't try to explain that. But what it underlined was the fact that the Chinese went back and said, there are no enemies out there. Nothing one needs to be worried about. So no need for this navy. Destroyed the navy, stopped training any ocean-going sailors, and just stopped altogether naval activities, except along the coast for coastal defense alone. And that remained the policy from 1435 until the British beat the Chinese in the Opium War in 1840. So that's a long period where the Chinese had no navy to speak of, had no naval force to speak of, and in fact never thought of doing anything more in the south, except to let some Chinese businessmen go in and out into Southeast Asia in particular. So this self-centeredness was deeply rooted. For the whole of the Ming and Qing dynasty, you can see that. It was deeply rooted, except for one area, and this is interesting, something to remind us of. And that is when the Chinese were conquered by the Manchus, that was much more in the tradition. That is very much more part of the norms that the Chinese experienced. To be invaded from the north by Manchus, Mongols, Turks, and various groups, Tibetans, for that matter, earlier on, Tibetans. All of them had their chances to invade China, and they did so again and again over something like 1,500 years, fairly regularly. In fact, if you go back further to the Xiongnu, it goes back for 2,000 odd years. So they've been invading China from overland for a long, long time. So the self-centeredness was not entirely self-devised, as it were. It was a defensive attitude towards all these invasions from the north. And one of the exceptions of this period was the fact that the Manchu conquerors of China, coming from the north, had a very different attitude towards the overland powers to the west of China. And they, instead of being self-centered alone, they were self-centered where the sea was concerned, but when it came to overland, they and their allies, the Mongol allies, from time to time, would invade and attack the Turks, the Turkish groups in what is now Xinjiang, and the Tibetan groups in Tibet from time to time. But it was not entirely military. It was all kinds of very complex commercial and diplomatic relations, even intellectual and religious relationships. But that was the exception. But even then, you see the limits to what they wanted to do. Again and again, you find the Chinese thinkers and the officials arguing that we must be content with what we have and protect and defend what we have. So that self-centeredness is a kind of repeated theme throughout that period. The famous story of how Lord Macartney went to see Emperor Qianlong, and Emperor Qianlong basically said, "We don't need anything from you. Thank you very much," and sent Lord Macartney home without the diplomatic relations that the Britain wanted to establish. And faithfully, that was in fact the reason why ultimately the only way relations could be established between the British and the Chinese was through war, because the Chinese couldn't be bothered to have a diplomatic relations with the British. And the British were really offended by that in many ways. But also, not only offended, but found it extremely inconvenient to go on trading with a country that did not have any diplomatic relations with the British. Something quite unacceptable in the way the world was developing with the global powers of the post-industrial revolution in Europe, with the kind of military technological superiority that they had, to something that they could not accept. But again, I'm going back just to remind ourselves that this American exceptionalism is not new. It is not American. It is actually deeply rooted. It's a kind of a systemic norm that goes back for at least 500 years. So, in a way, the only difference in 1990s was that behind that systemic norm, the dominance of the West, the Americans had now come out as the one leader of that norm, in which they, as the most powerful nation on earth, could be described as the sole superpower. That was new. And in that context, the rise of China, with China's own kind of exceptionalism, which is so self-centered for so long, how do these two exceptionalisms work together. You can say that, to put it very simply, the Chinese self-centeredness leads the Chinese to have been, for many centuries, much more relatively passive in its dealings with the outside world. And the West, since 1500, thereabouts, since Columbus, has been much more assertive and pushing forward and expanding their whole range of influence everywhere in the world. So the missionary drive is a much more positive push out, pressing upon other people to accept their good messages, what they were bringing to the world, and faced with the Chinese who were basically contented with what they had, in fact arrogant and somewhat complacent about what they had, and didn't think they needed anything from anybody else. Now that's the kind of thing that highlighted the relationship in the 19th century. In the 21st century, will it continue to be the same? What will the Chinese do? So then it comes to my subject today again. China, faced with these new norms, what should they do? One can look at various aspects of what the Chinese have been doing in the last few years. One of the clear ones, and I'll use that as the key point of entry into the topic here, is China's present call for the new maritime Silk Route. Very interesting concept. The Silk Road, as you know, the term is a very new one. It's not invented by the Chinese or by any Asians. It's actually invented by a German explorer, archaeologist, von Richthofen in the 19th century, because of the archaeological finds in Central Asia, but because of the dry air and so on, they were absolutely surprised how beautifully silk was preserved in the desert. And that was so astonishing to the archaeologists that you described it as a silk, the trade route was described as a silk road because of the silk. But of course silk was not the only item that was being traded there. But the fact that you could still find silk, more or less in very fine condition, 1,500 years old, still found in the desert, was what struck them. So they invented the term the Silk Road. And it was a very imaginative term because it caught the imagination of lots of people. And many, many scholars have written, I would say by now, hundreds of books and thousands of articles about that Silk Road. But remember, it was a Silk Road overland. It was describing basically the road from Chang'an to various parts. Maybe we can put the other end, the terminus, let's say Constantinople or Istanbul. Something like that. Between Chang'an and Istanbul and all the lands in between, that was the Silk Road. For more than 100 years, almost all the scholars wrote only about that Silk Road. The term was never used for anything else. But in 1968, I came across for the first time a book called The Maritime Silk Road. Interestingly enough, it was by a Japanese scholar, an archaeologist, art historian, who had been studying, of all things, ceramic distribution in Southeast Asia, South Asia, to the Middle East, from Japan, China, onwards. And he was discovering the linkages of that trading system that revealed through the layers of deposits of ceramics, how they were all linked up together. And he was so fascinated because he was an expert on ceramics. And, but interestingly enough, he decided there was a maritime route. But interestingly enough, he didn't call it the ceramic route, he called it the new maritime silk route. Why did he do that? I don't know, because no silk can be found in the tropics, because in the tropics the silk just disappears. Only in Central Asia could you find it. But he used it, I think, because the Japanese scholars in particular have been fascinated with the overland silk route for many, many years. You read the Japanese art history collections and the archaeological work in Japan from the Meiji period, right down to 1945. A number of studies about the Silk Route. They've gone into Central Asia, they were interested for all sorts of reasons. I don't want to go into that now. But so the idea of the Silk Route was very much in the minds of the Japanese. When the Japanese scholar discovered this ceramic trade route, and the reason why ceramics, because in the tropics, only the ceramics preserved so well. None of the textiles, silks, and all the other trading goods all disappeared in the tropics, but the ceramics was preserved. So he was able, through the study of ceramics, to establish this route in a very beautiful way. So that book he called The Maritime Silk Route. And that name has now caught up with us. It was picked up by the Chinese. The Chinese scholars also took an interest. Maybe the Chinese scholars were also thinking along these lines, but they didn't produce a book until 1980, 81. I met the professor who did that, Professor Chen Yang of Peking University. And interestingly enough, he came across the term, he invented the term for himself, the Maritime Silk Route, not from the Japanese end or from the Chinese southern coast, but from his study of Yunnan and Myanmar. He was an expert on the southwest China route to Myanmar, and he was looking at the ancient route that tied the trade of places like Sichuan into India, into Myanmar, down into the Indian Ocean. And of course that was recorded, but nobody thought it was a great route. But Chen Yang was probably one of the first people to say that actually that was much more significant than people realized. The records are not good, not too clear a chronology, but it was a very significant trade, and then he traces it. And he described that as the Maritime Silk Route. He had another Maritime Silk Route in mind, which was through Yunnan into Burma, and then from Burma into Bangladesh, that part of the world, into the Indian Ocean, another route. But nevertheless, he called his book The Maritime Silk Route. So when someone like Xi Jinping, now leader in China, brings up this old phrase, it has now a history of about 30 years since Chen Yang's book. But since then, the phrase, the Maritime Silk Route, has become extremely popular and important in China, particularly for the ports in southern China, and I'm thinking in particular of the port of Quanzhou. Those of you who are of Fujian ancestry would appreciate how important Quanzhou was for the last, ever since the Song Dynasty, and how that was the terminus of most of the trade between the Indian Ocean and China since at least the 10th century, the 10th and 11th century of our time. And for someone like President Xi Jinping, who had been in Fujian for over 20 years, he would have appreciated that importance for the Fujian people to have been at the terminal end of a very flourishing trade, which went on for 1,000 years. So it may be, I like to think that that was one of the inspirations why he was so attracted to this idea. But it is an inspiring idea, because what it tells us is, I think for the first time, a leader of China since, I don't know when, in fact, I can't think of another leader that ever did that in the past, to actually emphasize the word maritime, the sea. I don't recall any other leader in China ever talking about the importance of the sea in itself, intrinsically. But I think he does mean that. And he has allowed his supporters and the scholars in China everywhere to take this word up, and all the officials of the coast of China in particular, to take this phrase up and really build it up into a new way of conceiving of China's place in the world, where maritime is now important. Actually, it's very obvious why maritime is important. Now that we're all in a global economy, maritime is important to everybody. I don't know the exact figures. I've asked my economist friends to try and calculate it for me. But I think most of them are agreed that roughly 90% in volume of all the trade in the world is carried by sea. In volume, maybe not in value, in volume. Something like 90% is carried by sea. That makes the economy global. And if that is the case, which country in the world can afford not to be maritime to some extent? Except those unfortunate countries which have no coast whatsoever. Relatively few of them, but still there are some. But for everybody else that has the coast, it is the coast, the ports, the efficiency of the ports, the speed at which you can turn your cargo around, all these have become major factors in what we call the global economy today. I was very interested to hear that President Jokowi, first thing he announced is that the maritime future of Indonesia is going to be his #1 priority. And he actually appointed a coordinating minister for maritime affairs. Absolutely unusual. Never before, again, has that happened. So I think this consciousness of maritime relationships, the maritime basis of our global economy has risen a great deal in recent times. And President Xi Jinping's emphasis upon it should not be surprising. But what is interesting is how China develops from now. Why the emphasis upon it? I don't really know, of course, I don't know, he has not given publicly his reasons for doing it, but I would say that if you look at the message of the new maritime Silk Route, one has to think of a number of possibilities. One, however, is very clear it is not. I don't think there's any question of returning to, as some people have suggested, the Chinese want to go back to the old tributary system and dominate the region. I don't think that's on their minds at all. The Chinese know perfectly well that the world has totally changed. It is not like the world in which China was the dominant power in the region. Today there are many other powers. There's Japan, there's India, there's on the other side, of course, the United States and the Pacific. These are new factors that we take into account. There's a new kind of Southeast Asia, totally different with ASEAN, regionalism. So many new variables have entered the equation that there's no question of returning to any kind of past structure. So it is a future-looking, it's a future attitude that we have to consider. What is the future? I think that one of the Chinese concerns has been the accusation by certain governments, particularly the United States, that the Chinese should support the idea of freedom of navigation, accusing the Chinese of not believing in that. But that is absolute nonsense, because if you look at the history of the Chinese in the last 30, 40 years, they are perfectly aware that China's fantastic, remarkable economic development of the last 30 years would not have been possible if there was no freedom of navigation. They depend on it. Today more than ever, both in terms of resources and markets, they depend on the freedom of navigation. And the Chinese know perfectly well that freedom of navigation is essential for their future development. So there's no question about that. So I think in a way you can say that to talk about the maritime Silk Route is a way of the Chinese saying, yes, we agree with you. We believe in the freedom of navigation. This is what we need too. Another consideration is to say whether the emphasis upon maritime affairs, the rebuilding of a Chinese navy, is something like a defense against being contained. The containment policy of the United States and its allies. The Americans keep on denying that they want to contain China, but I don't think the Chinese believe that. So there's a lack of trust about that, which we can't help, but that's a fact. Neither side trusts each other enough to believe each other, whatever they assert. Just like the Chinese, when they say they want a peaceful development in the region, lots of people are very skeptical. When the Americans say that they do not want to contain China, most Chinese people are very skeptical. So these are some of the comparisons one can make. But the fact remains is that there is containment reality simply because of the island chains that's off the coast of China, which are all allies of the United States, and the United States have emphasized their return to the area, and the pivot, as it were, to pivot back to Asia, has simply alarmed the Chinese even more that this is part of a containment exercise which will limit and stop the Chinese from developing faster or developing as fast as it has done so far. So that's one possibility, that emphasizing a new maritime Silk Road reminds the world that the Chinese take maritime affairs seriously and do not want to be contained by sea. That's one possible message. I don't know whether any others, one can speculate. I won't go any further into that now, but try and conclude by drawing back to the region. What do we mean by the region? when I started, I was thinking very much in Malaysian terms, and Singapore, Malaysian terms. The region, we mean ASEAN, Southeast Asia. But the more I think about it, of course, this is simply not the case, and never been the case. ASEAN, we all trace the history to 1967, thereabouts, it's quite a long while now. But in fact, the ASEAN today is only since the late 1990s. It's less than 20 years that the 10 countries of Southeast Asia has come together as ASEAN. So in less than 20 years, you can't expect too much of it. It's really a new boy in the game. And it is still finding itself, maybe putting it too strongly, but it's really trying to find a role for itself. In very simple terms, ASEAN, if it was a real regional organization, speaking with one voice, unanimous in agreeing what its interests are, can be a very important factor in the future of all developments in the Asia-Pacific, Indian Ocean, the whole of Asia, even in global affairs, if it can achieve that status. I think it's a long way from there yet. The efforts are very promising, and a great deal of people, whole 2 generations of officials, scholars, business people have all tried to help to build up this image of ASEAN, but it is still a long way to go. And one of the reasons why it is still a long way to go, because the concept of region itself is a very flexible one. It's by no means clear that you can talk of this region so specifically as all that. As you can see, different countries have different ideas about the region. For the Americans, for example, the region would be the Asia Pacific. That is a region for them. And to them, it's the Western Pacific across on the other side, and the region covers vaguely all of East and Southeast Asia. It's what we call the Western Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand, and all the islands in the South Pacific. For China, the region probably is East Asia plus Southeast Asia is their region. I'm not sure that they are that exclusive about it. But if you look at the Chinese situation, the Chinese is not a maritime power. It is not just a concern about the sea, no matter what how we interpret President Xi Jinping's maritime silk route. Because actually, he at the same time also emphasized the overland route, the original Silk Road that crossed Central Asia into Europe, into the Mediterranean. And today, if you visit places like Chongqing or Chengdu, you find people telling you with great excitement about the future of their railroads and the transportation system that would give them direct access to the markets in Europe, through Russia, through the Central Asian states, to the Mediterranean. In fact, when I was in Chongqing last, they had a big model of a whole railway track system that links Chongqing all the way to Hamburg in Europe, and they were very excited by it. And they still got a long way to go before it becomes really efficient, but you can see how their imagination is taking them. So China is not just maritime. If you look at the geography of it, it's very simple. China is roughly 1/3 maritime, 2/3 overland. If that ratio is meaningful, then the Chinese maritime is only a 1/3 part of their vital interest. They are just as interested, if not more so, about their overland relationships, with borders with something like 13 or 14 different countries, some of which pretty unstable, very uncertain, some of them still not settled, like that between China and India. Lots of problems overland. So their maritime Silk Road is only a part of their region. Their idea, even when they think about East and Southeast Asia, is only a part of China's region. China's region, in my mind, has to include Eurasia. That is a very important part. And if you trace it back to the way the Chinese very rapidly responded to the fall of the Soviet Union, how quickly they set up the Shanghai Cooperation Program. And that was immediately successful because they understood the necessity for that program to link up China with the new Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, all of them together with Russia, the Russian Commonwealth. And that was done very quickly. And the success of that overland relationship as compared with the maritime relationship is in sharp contrast if you look at the two of them. And it reminds you that the Chinese are much more aware and conscious of their overland problems than you realize. So even when they emphasize today the maritime Silk Route as a new concern, do not underestimate their real concern for the overland relationships, which are very complicated indeed. So bear that in mind, then China's region is not this part of the world. This part is only 1/3 of their region. Their region, you must take into account their concern for the whole of the Eurasian border that the Chinese have. So that's two different regions. The Asia Pacific from the United States, Eurasia plus the South China Sea, East China Sea for the Chinese. And for ASEAN, is it really enough to be just Southeast Asia? I'm not sure it is. And in fact, I'm sure that the ASEAN leaders don't have that limit in mind. ASEAN is to play a role in a much larger region. And its importance comes from the fact that it can play a role in a larger region. Just to get together, of course, it's hard enough. ASEAN countries are all struggling to make sure that they stay completely agreed and united on every topic. But that's in the work in progress, and doing pretty well on the whole. But actually, in the end, what is it for? It is really to play a role in the larger region. And when you think about that, then you realize that ASEAN is actually between two oceans, between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, as far as the sea is concerned. As far as land is concerned, nearly half of ASEAN is on the continent, the other half at the sea. So it has both a land and a sea frontier, so to speak, and can play a role in both. If you look at it proportionally, it's quite an interesting bit of mathematics for you, simple mathematics. 1/3 Chinese, 2/3, 1/3 maritime, 2/3 land for China. About, if you look at land borders, about something like 4/5 maritime and 1/5 overland for ASEAN, for Southeast Asia, roughly. But for the United States, very interesting again. It's long away across the Pacific, far away. But the United States has a tremendous advantage. Again, an advantage that no other country in the past has ever had. It's an advantage of being in a continent in which it has no enemies. Nobody can threaten the United States on land, over land. I love my Canadian friends and Mexican friends, but I don't think they're in any position to give any trouble to the United States. But so it's a perfectly safe place overland, so that all of the United States' attention can be actually turned to the sea, as it has done across the Atlantic for the last couple of hundred years, and now they're turning their attention to the Pacific, probably for the next 200 years. That's where their attention is going to be. So this is the attention of a power that is totally safe overland, on land, on the continent. And so that they have the tremendous power to project anywhere else in the world by sea, and of course you can talk about land and cyberspace and so on, but by sea, the global part, as I mentioned, is the sea that is the crucial part of this. And by sea, all their resources can be put to work on their maritime position in the world. Now you can see the differences now. So when we talk about the region, what do you mean by Asia Pacific for the United States? What do you mean by the region for China? And what ultimately, this is too early to say, but what ultimately is the region for Southeast Asia? We see that the concept of region itself needs to be continually looked at very closely to understand what we mean. For myself, I would say, I wish ASEAN well. It has tremendous potential. It deserves to succeed because to bring historically, remarkable miracle, to bring these 10 countries together into one community is a remarkable adventure, and I wish it every success, because if it was successful, and eventually is successful, it will play a major role by its location in that area, the land-sea placement that it enjoys, and with that, it seems to me that its place in the world, its core position in this larger region would be assured. And in the middle of it is Malaysia. Thank you very much.